Welcome to Third Eyesight. I'm your host, Juan Francisco, and I'm a spiritual intuitive who practices tarot card reading and mediumship. I've always been super curious about the supernatural and paranormal, and I'm here to share my stories and interview folks who want to share their own stories. Let's get to it. I'm here with Vinny Carbone, Paranormal Investigator. He's been featured on CBS Sunday Morning, Travel Channel's Haunted USA and the Holzer Files, Buzzfeed Unsolved, and Barstool Sports. Pretty much an amazing repertoire of where he's been featured on TV, on YouTube. Vinny, thank you for joining us today.
Juan, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I met Vinny several years ago at the Morris-Jumel mansion when he used to do paranormal investigations at the mansion and had a pretty amazing experience there. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But tell us, how did you get into paranormal investigation? How did it all start for you?
Well, I was always fascinated by the idea of ghosts, and by fascinated, I mean terrified. I was really into anything spooky or weird, urban legends or folklore, and the biggest one for me was ghost stories. And I was growing up, I would watch like In Search of and Unsolved Mysteries was really big at the time. And then as I got older and I started to realize that I had an affinity for, theater and performance, and I went to college, and then it was in college where I had my first actual unusual, probably paranormal experience for myself. And that's when I said, okay, this is something that I want to take some time and investigate. And it's very unexpected. It's been something that I never thought I would be doing. But I got into it. And as you mentioned, I worked at Morris-Jumel Mansion for a number of years in New York. And just by proxy of working there, I was able to really investigate this, no pun intended, a little bit more, not just, there at the mansion, but, people would come there asking questions. And just by, because it was a small staff, they would say, oh, you want to talk about ghosts? Well, here's this guy, Vinny. And that would lead me to doing interviews and podcasts and some TV spots, and then meeting other people in the industry and just kind of branching out. Now, whenever I go on vacation anywhere, or I'm in a town or a city for an extended period of time, I'll try to make it a point to go and investigate wherever I am.
And for you, what did it take to become a paranormal investigator? Was this your own curiosity and self-taught, or did you work with other people who had been experienced in the field?
Well, there was definitely the organic curiosity of it, and then quite simply, people think that you got to go to school for it, or and you could, there's definitely parapsychology and all kinds of studies about that. But for me, it really just started out as an interest, and then it just was a lot of things that have happened in my life that have worked out have been by way of luck or coincidence. For me, after I graduated college. So I went to SUNY Brockport in upstate New York, Rochester, New York, and one of my classmates, one of my good friends, he was also living in the area after we graduated, and we were both broke and working dead end jobs and restaurants and stuff like that, and we would just hang out at night watching ghost shows and talking about paranormal theory and terminology, and then one thing led to another, and we started going on investigations, and then I moved to New York and came across the Morris-Jumel Mansion, and I was commissioned to write and direct a play for them for that year, for that fall, and chose it to be about the ghosts of the mansion. And by working on that show at that location, then I was offered a full-time job as the events director. And so when I got that position at the museum, I said, "Hey, there's obviously an interest in this topic here at the mansion. Why don't we spearhead it and make it an actual event?" And they gave it a shot, and it was very successful. And I'm very proud to say that over the 3 or 4 years that I was working there in some capacity, it was probably the most popular event that we had. So that's kind of that's been my path. And then since then I've moved on. I've moved back upstate, and I've done some other things in life, but the paranormal has always been a very evident thing for me over the last decade. And just kind of plugging away at, lecturing wherever I can or investigating wherever I can, and taking any opportunity to further this study for myself at least.
And rewinding back to your college days, are you able to share with us like what you experienced that kind of was like a was it one impetus probably of several in your life that got you into paranormal investigation?
Yeah, so it was the thing, people always ask, what's the scariest thing or what's the most profound piece of evidence or anything like that. And honestly, it was this moment that I'm about to tell you. And it didn't happen on an investigation. So in college, I had a couple different jobs on campus just to make ends meet. And one of them, I was working as a night desk attendant. And so what that meant was that a couple of nights a week, I would sit down in the lobby of my dorm, and from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. And I would just check people's IDs as they came in. So in the event something happened, something, unfortunate happened, the campus security would have a way to, go back and see who was in the building and when. So I remember it was like a Tuesday or a Wednesday night. And I know that because you never wanted to work like Thursday or Friday or Saturday because those were the party nights. So it was a really quiet night. It was after midnight. No one had come in for like the last 2 hours. And the way that the lobby was set up, I know out of context, it may not make a whole lot of sense, but the way that the lobby was set up was that in front of me was a set of doors that you would walk through. You would scan your card and come through. And then there'd be like a very short, narrow hallway. And then directly in front of me was a giant window that I could see out and see the dorm building across from me. And then to the left of me, recessed into the wall, was a men's room and a women's room. And then to the right of me was a giant like common room area where they had like a couple TVs and couches. And then behind me was the elevators, and then all the way down the hallway was the stairwell. And my back would be up against the outer corner of the office that the RDs would work in during the day. So I needed to get something from the office. So I stood up, I walked around the corner, and I went to go open the door, and I saw that it was locked. So I came back around. And when I came back to get the keys off my desk, I could hear the muffled sound of water running. And at first I thought it was the wind blowing in the leaves outside. So I went over and I looked out the window, and the leaves weren't moving. So then as I was walking back to my desk, I realized it was actually coming from the men's room. And I thought that was insane because no one had been in. I know no one was in, unless someone was in the bathroom since before I came down into the lobby, a couple hours earlier, and then just happened to turn on the water when I walked away for those 4 seconds. But nonetheless, I opened the door and I could hear the water running. I could hear a faucet. So I turned on the lights in one of the sinks. Sure enough, both of the faucets were on. So I walked over and I was in total disbelief. I turned it off and I just sat there for a second, really questioning what just happened. And I was really trying to go through everything in my mind. Like, was I seeing something? Was I exhausted? Because, I was a theater major and I was a broadcasting major. So I was constantly working on multiple projects. You know, and I worked at a hardware store throughout high school and college whenever I was home on vacations. And, my dad's a contractor. So I was really playing through everything that I knew, basic knowledge of plumbing, what could possibly happen. Were the washers warped or, worn, and the water pressure forced their way, up against it and turned it on? No, that's not really what happened because it didn't happen again after that. So I remember I called my roommates. They came down. I told them what happened. They're like, I don't know what to tell you. And then they went back up. And then the elevators kept opening, coming up and down and opening up and closing, but no one was getting off. And then a couple of weeks later, the same thing happened to another night desk attendant, a girl. And then we found out from the RD of the building that she had been working there since the 70s. And the one year that she was placed in another building in the 90s, a male RA had actually hanged himself in the stairwell right
Wow.
where I was sitting. So I was like, okay, well, that's pretty spot on. You got a male RA, you got the men's room faucet turning on. Now, and this is one of those moments where it's like, all right, let's say ghosts are real. Why are they coming back to turn the water on? Like, that's the most profound thing they can do. I don't know. I don't have that answer, but that's all it took for me to really say, okay, let's take a look at this further.
Wow. And these were faucets. I mean, just getting a little bit technical. These
Yeah.
were not were they motion detective faucets?
No, no, it was two knobs, like one for hot, one
Wow.
for cold. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
I'm
And
sure if you were to go to the dorm now, which I should, because now I live back in the area. I'm sure by now it's been renovated. As a matter of fact, I know that that lobby has been renovated, so I'm sure that they've changed the faucets to motion sensors now.
Right, right. And so then taking it from there, in places you've investigated yourself, whether as part of a tour, being a tour lead, or on your own, across all the places you've investigated, has there been one that's been the most memorable or the most striking in your memory?
Well, yeah. So there certainly have been some that are, I hold a special place for. Morris-Jumel in New York City. Certainly, that's kind of like that was my training ground. That's where I really made a name for myself, I guess, if you could say that in this field. So I'll always have a deep appreciation for that location, not only because of what it's done for me and how it taught me and how I was able to grow and learn as an investigator, but because of just the countless hours I spent there working on other projects that are outside of the paranormal, working on theater projects, what have you, and the connections and friendships that I made because of that location. Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville. I was very fortunate enough to investigate there twice. Um, and then down in Staten Island, historic Richmond town. I love that location because even though it's in one of the boroughs of the city, it has such a different feel to it. I've always said it has a very like high school homecoming feel to it. There's always like the smell of like bonfire in the air, and it's a very different crowd than other boroughs. Yeah, and there's multiple buildings on the campus itself. It's not just one central building. There's many different historic buildings on the campus, and they all have their own personalities, so to speak. I've had experiences in almost all of them, so that one's really cool. There's still buildings there that I've yet to even get into, so hopefully one of these days I can get there.
Over in Staten Island, there's the my mind's blanking on it, but it's the former mental asylum that's now a college campus that got popular in that 70s. It's pretty much the mental asylum that closed all mental asylums back in the day.
Right. Yeah. There was a documentary about it. It was called Cropsy because of the murders that were happening
Right.
over there. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever been to that campus? I think
I,
now CUNY, it's a CUNY campus.
I believe so. I do know that there's an abandoned part of the hospital, and I don't know if they're one and the same. To be perfectly frank with you,
Yeah.
I know a lot of like urban explorers go over there and take photos and stuff like that. You're not really supposed to, so I'm not advising to do that.
Yeah.
But Staten Island is very interesting because you know, it's like I said, it's set apart from the other boroughs and it's got its own very rich history. Definitely a very spooky history as well. You got St. Andrew's Church right next to Richmond Town, which Ghost Hunters has done an episode there years and years ago. There's a lot to see over there.
Yeah, and it's a different. Besides that, it's a different vibe, like you said, from the other four boroughs. It's totally the culture
Uh,
feels different there.
it's Willowbrook State Hospital was the
That's it, Willowbrook.
yes.
Yes, that's it. I was gonna Google it myself, but yeah, that's exactly what it is. And so at Morris-Jumel Mansion, which is where I met you, that was actually my first paranormal investigation or ghost tour, so to speak, anywhere
Mhm.
of that kind. I've done ghost tours in cities where you're walking around outside, but this was investigating a building, which is different for me.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have to say, you built quite a legacy with that series of tours over the years. It was an excellent tour. I've had people
Thank
tell
you.
me when they went to go do a tour with you that they felt it was excellent. What is the most intriguing thing you experienced at the Morris-Jumel Mansion in terms of the paranormal?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for saying that. I'll Venmo you later. But what I was gonna say is that over the years, there, again, it's one of those things where uh, and I always preface a couple of things, obviously, as you know, in my investigations. The big one is that I do not tell anyone. I try to tell you right from the onset that my job is not to convince you whether or not ghosts are real. That's not what tonight's about. That's not what the tour is about. My job is just to impart to you some knowledge, some experience, some terminology, some theory, and then you do with that information what you will. And the other part of it too, at the end of the night, is not to downplay anything that we may have had happen during the investigation, but to come there for 3 hours expecting, to hear all these stories about we saw this and we heard that, whatever. Well, yeah, because we're there for hours and hours on end. It would be very commonplace for us to work 60, 70 hours during the summer. So for a guest to come for 3 hour, a 3 hour investigation and not really have anything happen, yeah, that's kind of expected. That all being said, a lot of my most profound experiences there happened when I was just working. I was sitting in my office and I had the door closed, and the third floor of the mansion, which is not open to the public, was where the soldiers would stay during the revolution. And the servants also stayed up there too when it was a residence. There's been several times I was sitting at my desk and I would hear someone clearly walking back and forth. And I could hear the planks moving, the floor, because they're those wide original planks. And and I thought, because this has happened, where guests will sneak past a little sign that says "Do not enter, staff only," and I'll find someone up there, totally, a living person, and I would get up to open the door to expect to have that interaction again, and there would be no one. I was sitting in the gift shop and I saw a white mass just dart past the door, and I thought it was one of our interns because we had gotten two interns that day, but I didn't hear them or anything like that. So I got up, and of course there was no one there. The doorbell ringing, that's happened to me like 3 or 4 times. When the gate is locked, I think that I locked someone in the park, and I would get up and there's no one there. That's really freaky. Um, Hearing a woman singing on the third floor after an investigation. So it was myself and two other people, and we could very clearly hear a woman sing like a couple of measures of something. And then when we stopped, it stopped. But probably the scariest thing that's ever happened on an investigation was when it was a public investigation. We were in the basement, which is where we end, and the 6 foot table that was in front of us, and that we had guests sitting on all three sides of it, it just jumped about 2 to 3 feet toward the fireplace, and it was one of these moments where the human mind doesn't know to laugh or to cry or to scream or whatever, because it's just such an unusual, shocking moment. So everyone screamed, and then everyone started laughing, like a nervous laughter. And then, of course, trying to be a good investigator, you try to immediately debunk it. And again, I would have to like show you a diagram, but basically sitting at the head of the table, where the position where as if they could have pushed it forward, was a mom, a dad, and like a teenage son. And then sitting right next to them on the other side of the table was an elderly couple. And I assumed that the kid kicked the table, but by accident. And when I asked, okay, who did that, he was embarrassed, whatever, and he didn't say anything. However, after that investigation, that couple that was sitting right next to him, they've come on like two or three other investigations. And when I tell that story, the wife says it wasn't the kid because he had really shiny shoes on, and they were so shiny she could see them in the dark. And she goes, she was looking at his feet, and all of a sudden the table moved. And it kind of would have had to have been them, because if someone on the other side of the table moved it, it would have gone left or right, not
Right.
forward or backwards. So, I mean, so the jury's still out about that. That, like I said, we've had little wacky things happen, like books falling upwards on a bookshelf. So, like a stack of three books, instead of from the top down falling, it was from
Yeah.
the bottom up falling. We've had it where we had this. It was like a Christmas ornament hanging in the basement, and this is when the mansion was actually closed for about 7 months. We had a really bad leak in the octagon room. And so we were just there cleaning and stuff like that. And I went into the staff kitchen. I came out. When I came out, I looked at the fireplace on the mantle, and the ornament was swinging back and forth. And it did that for like 15 minutes. It did it for so long that I got other staff members to come down, and we tried to recreate a breeze or anything like that. And there was nothing that could have explained why it was doing that. It was just very unusual, just subtle enough to get our attention. But it was little stuff like that happen all of the time.
Wow. Well, that story of the table, is it the wooden table that's usually down there? Or was it like a table that's propped up just for investigations?
No, it was one of our, plastic and metal 6 foot tables.
Okay.
And what's unusual, so the thing about the basement is that the whole house has had experiences, or there's been little incidences in each spot, but the basement is really unusual. I wasn't there for this. I was actually on my way to the mansion from my apartment, but it was one of the nights that we were having a play. It was the play that I wrote back in 2015, and the former executive director and the former visitor services manager were up in the gift shop, and all of a sudden they heard, now the park is locked, the house is closed, and they're waiting, for audience to arrive and stuff like that to do pre-show, whatever. And all of a sudden they heard what sounded like two women laughing, and then they heard the 6-foot table get shoved. And they heard, it was the very distinct sound of the metal leg scraping on the brick floor.
Right.
And so they ran down there thinking that someone had jumped the fence, snuck in, because that also has happened. I mean, we've had people try to break in, countless times. So they ran down there, and of course, they looked everywhere and they didn't find anybody. They texted the caretaker, said, "Hey, did you guys just pop in for a second?" And they're like, "No, we're out to dinner in Brooklyn." So, and then when they stopped and they looked, they saw that the table was in fact off center. So someone did move it.
Wow. Yeah, one time I was in the kitchen, and actually I told you had a colleague that used to work with you there, and I told him right after it happened, I was down there, and it's kind of hard to explain because I kept feeling like my mind was playing tricks on me, but um you know how when dust reflects light, when you see dust in front of a window and you kind of, well, sometimes people
Yes,
say
it
it reflects
glimmers.
light, or the dust is really clear because it's from front of a sunny window. It's
Yes.
like I saw something moving like dust, but it was shining and glimmering. It was like, I mean, dust doesn't really reflect light. I kind of said that wrong or described it wrong, but it's like as if the dust was moving, but this brilliant light, I can't explain it. It was like something, it's like if someone took a small fluorescent light bulb, a really shiny one, and just like
Mhm.
waved it in front of the window. And when I looked, it was in my peripheral vision. When I looked, there was nothing there, and I didn't
Mhm.
see any dust flying around. So I don't know, but that was down in the basement where the kitchen used to be. It's an extraordinary house.
It's a very storied house. I mean, so much history there, but I I've often said that each room or each section is like a different scene altogether. And it is, the basement is a very different feel and atmosphere from Elijah Jamel's bedroom, from the octagon room, from the main entrance. And, like I said, there's been stories throughout the years all over, so it's truly an experience, and yeah.
Aaron Burr's room is the one room in that house where I feel like the energy or whatever it is in there is the thickest. How do you feel about that? Because I feel like I step in there, it's like it feels like something different from the rest of the house.
Yeah, I mean, so to be perfectly honest, you know me. You've investigated with me, and my big mantra is working from a place of logic and reasoning and science first, and psychology. And I try not to get into how do I feel in a location, even though I'm a huge advocate of paying attention to your senses, because if I was to tell you, it's the old thing. If I was to walk you in a group of people in front of an old building, and I say, okay, let's do some word association, within the first 5 seconds, someone's going to say haunted or ghost or anything like that. So, if you're there for a ghost hunt to begin with, you're going to expect that kind of activity. Um, but for me, I've had plenty of experiences outside of feeling that are pretty concrete. We've had a lot of electrical play in there. We've had lights turn on and turn off by themselves. We've had people seeing other people in there. We've had the most profound EVP that I was ever a part of was captured in that room. So there's been tons of experiences in that room. Yes.
And along that same vein of what you're saying about, because that's a totally fair point. When you have a certain mindset, like you're going on a ghost tour and paranormal investigation, a lot of people go and they kind of want to get spooked. So it's
Right.
kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy for the night. So along that same line of thought, what is the biggest indication that if you experience something like, or what in your experience has been the biggest proof that someone has thought something up or made something up, or their subconscious made it up, as opposed to it being concrete paranormal evidence? Like, what's a good example of when to look out for whether it's our psychology or the paranormal?
Well, I mean, there's multiple ways to unpack that, but basically, well, first and foremost, and unfortunately, we tend to see, we see a lot of people who've had a very close loss in their lives pretty recently, kind of reaching out to the paranormal as like a last ditch, or trying to, as kind of like a thing of like, I hope they're okay. I hope that there's more to life, or whatever the case is. Um, but and those are the people that I actually advise to stay away from the paranormal, at least for a time being, because you're too close to the fire, so to speak. It's tough because I'm not in the business of just trying to discredit people, and their experiences. However, I do spend a large portion of my lectures unpacking the psychology of the paranormal and how we got to this point, and why is this still a thing in the human psyche and lexicon in 2022, whatever year it is, and why is it this thing that authors were writing about, in Christmas Carol and the Bible and Shakespeare and all that? Why is this something we're still concerned with? Why is it one of the number one things on Travel Channel and all those shows? It's because at the end of the day, it's a couple things. People like to be scared. And why do people like to be scared? They like to feel alive. Same reason why they go on roller coasters. Same reason why people go bungee jumping or watch scary movies. It's that false sense of accomplishment. It's that release of endorphins. So there's definitely a physiological connection to it. People have had experiences and they want, confirmation and affirmation that they're not crazy, or people have never had an experience and they're out to prove that there's no such thing as ghosts. And I welcome all of them. But to bring it back to your original question, how to tell if someone's full of it? I mean, it's just one of those things where, you gotta go with your gut. I mean, I've seen some real doozies when it comes to, people doing cold readings of rooms and stuff like that during a seance. But then I've had people, and this is the bizarre thing about the paranormal, is that unfortunately, there is that stigma attached to the topic, and credible people, will have an experience, and they might share it with one or two people, and they get laughed at, and then they like kind of retreat, and they don't share that experience again. And then when they come, I can't tell you how many times I'll be in the middle of a lecture, and someone will just blurt out a story that they've had happen to them that's got nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's like, okay, well, thank you for sharing that, but it's because now they feel safe. It's a safe space to talk about this. And I've had the most skeptical people be like, "Oh yeah, I don't believe in ghosts, but there was one time I saw a guy walk through a wall." Or there was a woman that used to work at the mansion. She said that she would have to stay in the caretaker's apartment downstairs, and she would say, "Yeah, I don't really believe in ghosts, but sometimes when I'm sleeping downstairs, I hear boots walking across the floor upstairs in the middle of the night." So, okay, so then what's that? Like, how do you explain that? Very, very simply, then what is that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like I said, I mean, I've had psychologists, like, people who had a business, and like patients come to me and tell me a bizarre story about how they were at the opera with their wife, and all of a sudden they looked up, and floating above them was his father who had passed away. And he turned and he looked, and his wife was looking up at the father as well. And when he told me that story, I'm like, well, that's pretty unbelievable, right? But this is a guy who's dedicated his life to literally psychology and academia. So, I mean, again, we have this thing of, we want to believe people, especially if they come with some kind of credence and accreditation. But then if I'm not going to believe him, well, then who do I believe? And that's where this sense of like trust and all that come into play. So I don't know is the simple answer to your question.
Yeah, and that's a very fair answer. And I think what's fascinating is, and one of the reasons I started this podcast is because there's something universal about these kinds of stories. I mean, they're not just stories that happen in the United States. People have stories all over the world. They've
Right.
written about it for ages and ages. And so given the stories you've heard, the investigations you've done on a personal level for you, how has this work and your experiences, how have they shaped your understanding of what some people may call the other side, or what happens after death?
Um,
It's a big question.
Yeah, it's shaped it in so much as, I don't think I have any more of an answer than when I started out, to be perfectly honest with you. Again, I don't try to BS anyone. I don't try to put myself out there as any more of an authority figure than I really am. I'm just a guy that's got some electronic equipment, that's had some experiences, and comes to the table with some theory and terminology. Um, what I will say is, I think back in the day, before I actually started investigating, I probably had the idea that if you wanted to, you could probably rid a location of a spirit. Whereas now, based upon my experiences and all that, I really do think that they're gonna go when they're ready to go. The best that you could hope for is you could learn to coexist. But that being said, you know, um, I've investigated a private residence where the family was having situation where everyone in the family had had some kind of an experience. The father had been touched twice in the basement to the point where he didn't want to go into the basement. The daughter was grabbed in the back of her leg a couple of times. The mother was like touched while she was sleeping. The dog wouldn't go into the dining room. And we were doing an investigation, and I was saying, listen, we're not doing this, and I don't want you to think that we're going to do this and suddenly they're going to go away. I think half the battle is maybe just recognizing that they're there. And that might be all they want, is just some kind of recognition. And once they have that, then they might feel like, okay, you know what? Now I can go, I can move on, or I can leave you be. And so while we are doing the investigation, I said, listen, if there's anything you want to say, maybe now's the time. And the wife, said, listen, please don't bother us. Don't leave us alone. We don't want to be scared. We're not here to harm you, whatever. And from what I've heard ever since then, it's gone away.
Mm.
So I really think it's a matter of luck. It's a matter of approach and technique. And sometimes, like I said, it could lay dormant again for a while and then pop back up. So that's probably been the biggest realization that I've had. And the other realization is that, what you see on TV and all that, a lot of it is just entertainment. I'm not discrediting what they do, and I'm not saying what they're doing is fake or the evidence that they get is fake, but they speak in definites. They say things like, we know spirits do this. We know that. It's like, well, how do you know that? Did they tell you personally and no one else? When I say something, I say I believe or it's believed or a theory is, and then fill in the blank.
Right. And it's about being open. And with these TV shows, they're so heavily edited. And I mean, I was going to ask you if there's a myth about investigation of this kind that you could debunk or just obliterate what it would be. And what's coming to mind for me right now is people when they go on these tours, they really expect it to be like what's the Ghost Hunters or fill in the blank Travel Channel TV show,
Right.
and they don't. And there's something that you actually said in that investigation that I went on with you that I've always remembered is it takes time to get good evidence. It's not like you spend 3-4 hours, and you already alluded to this. You
Yeah.
spend 3-4 hours, you're going to get three knocks, and I mean, if you're lucky, you get three
Yeah.
knocks on a wall. But are there any other myths or any other misconceptions that you hear about when you do investigations of people for the public that you would want to obliterate, so to speak?
So here's the thing. Outside of the paranormal, growing up, I was a big fan of pro wrestling. And full disclosure, as an adult, I love to check out a wrestling match every once in a while. Do I know it's fixed? Do I know it's a show? Absolutely. But guess what? I go into that. There's a social contract that I've, signed saying, hey, I'm willing to give up the fact that they're not actually fighting, that this is choreographed, and that's okay. It's entertainment. And I do believe, whether people want to believe it or not, or admit it or not, that's the same thing when they watch a lot of these shows. They know that at the end of the day, this probably shouldn't be taken too seriously as groundbreaking proof of the paranormal. That's not to say that there hasn't been a few examples on throughout the many many years of different paranormal shows where things have happened. It's like, hey, that's pretty profound, right? One that I can think of is on the old version of Ghost Hunters. They had this insane EVP session at a hotel with the princess who used to stay there, and it was like they were having a full blown conversation with this spirit. But the thing about it, about the shows, is that yes, at the end of the day, they have a job to do, and that job is to entertain. And what I always say in the quick breakdown of it is, if you look at an hour-long broadcast, when you take out the commercials, it's cut down to about 42 minutes. And in that 42 minutes, what you're not realizing is that when they go to film these at these locations, they're there for 3 to 5 days, and they're filming for hours and hours on end. And in those 3 to 5 days, They're doing B-roll, they're doing reenactments, they're doing, interviews and all that. And then when you actually look at how much time in the episode is in they're investigating, so, in black and white or in night vision, it's only, half of the show. And then when you look at how much evidence or, possible evidence that they get, it's really only a few seconds. So in 3 to 5 days, they get a few seconds of what might be possibly evidence. Anyone with enough money, producers, and spooky music can make a pretty good looking ghost hunting show. You know what I mean? And listen, full disclosure, I have a YouTube channel, and that's not me just trying to plug it, but that's what we do. We're trying to create something that's pretty down to earth, not so much like the other shows, but at the end of the day, I know that people are looking at it not just for evidence, but also because they want to see a good product, right?
Right.
So it comes down to entertainment as well.
And you've been present for that kind of production before at the Morris-Jumel mansion, right? Haven't you been on
Yeah,
campus
yeah,
when shows have
yeah.
come in? Yeah.
Yep, yeah, a couple times, and I'm pretty straightforward with them. With the producers, say, "Listen, I don't want to be a part of anything that's faked." And for me, the big thing was that because for years and years, Eliza Jamel was cast aside. She wasn't even like when the museum first became a museum in 1907. They didn't even acknowledge the Morrises or the Jamels. They didn't acknowledge the Morrises because they're English. They didn't acknowledge the Jamels because she was, an actress from Rhode Island and he was French. And if you know anything about theater history, is that, actors at that time were in the same cast of people as alcoholics and derelicts and prostitutes. And there was that unfortunate rumor that Eliza was a prostitute. And I always remind people, maybe she did. I don't know. I didn't see her accounting at the time, but I do know that she was an actor. So maybe that's where the cross wires came in that, oh, actor, prostitute, drunk, whatever. Oh, she was a prostitute, right? Because it was the easy thing to do. Also, she was an outsider. She was very business savvy and very smart with the money, and the majority of the wealth came from her. But I think that, trying to break into that scene at that time in New York was near impossible, especially being married to a Frenchman. But anyway, so let's say when the museum became a museum, they focused on the 5 weeks that George Washington was there. It was called the Washington headquarters, and that was it. And not until very recent history did they start to open it up a little bit more. And still, unfortunately, when I was working there, people would come there and say, "We heard Elijah Jamel murdered Stephen." Well, that's the old legend, and we know where that came from. And we tell that story of where it came from is, an unfortunate court battle that ensued after her death between her adopted grandchildren. But so it's that was a big thing for me with these producers was saying, hey, we're not going to fake any evidence and we're not going to perpetuate this idea that Eliza was a murderous prostitute. She was a very business savvy woman of her time, and deal with it kind of thing. So
Yeah, I've watched episodes of several TV shows that took place at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. There was one that really painted her, and with the B-roll, they had an actress portray her, and you probably know
right.
what show I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And they had this actress make like this really like sour looking face, and like
yeah,
she was, Eliza was menacing, whatever. And
yeah,
it's like, well, I mean, we don't really know that, and so yeah, there are people that have perpetuated that idea that she was this evil wife wannabe widow.
yeah.
So,
And that's unfortunate because that hasn't really changed much nowadays, right? A
right.
successful or motivated woman equates to deviant behavior. And so, and for
Mm,
what it was worth, that was quite honestly one of the big motivating factors for us to do the paranormal so that we could dispel those rumors.
right.
There are people in that neighborhood that refuse to set foot on the campus anywhere because they're convinced the house is evil. And so hopefully little by little by little, we're trying to dispel that, those rumors and those stories and say, hey, listen, the house might be haunted, but if it is, they're not here to kill you, to possess you or anything like that. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Now, how can people find out more about you and what you do?
So I have a Instagram, Carbone_paranormal. And then I also have a YouTube channel. It's just Vinny Carbone, Paranormal Investigator. And on the YouTube channel, you're going to find featured media that I've been a part of. So any of these shows that you mentioned in the beginning, but then also some original content as well. I have a series called Investigations with Vinny Carbone, which is where I go and investigate locations all around the country. And then I have a series called Beyond the Haunt, which is where basically it's what you would see if you came to one of my lectures. It's just broken out into, it's just topics broken out into like 4 to 5 minute episodes, talking about, um, negative connotations of the paranormal, psychology, equipment, stuff like that. So, looking to put up a few more episodes of that throughout the year and looking to film at a couple of new locations coming up. So, but it's tough because you got to get the crew together and everyone's got, other things going on. So, but we appreciate all the help and support. And on the Instagram is where you're going to see any posting for any lectures coming up or anything like that. So keep an eye on there for lecture locations and ticket information, stuff like that.
Great. And I want to put in a plug for your paranormal investigations, public paranormal investigations at Historic Richmond Town, which you mentioned in Staten Island, New York. Mid-October, mid-November. I'm going to be joining mid-October. Super excited for that. You can go
Yeah.
to historicrichmondtown.org, historicrichmondtown.org, and go to the events tab. And very briefly, could you share with us what is the historical context of Historic Richmond Town?
It's kind of, if you're familiar with the history of Richmond Town, it's kind of all represented right there. We have the courthouse, the county courthouse, which is where some big trials of the time happened. It actually burned down a couple of times, and they rebuilt it. A hanging took place there. There's a cemetery right there. You have the Vorlaser house, which is where the story that comes out of there is Pretty Van Pelt befriends a Hessian soldier. He's a drummer, and unfortunately, she falls ill during the war, and he has this premonition and a dream where, by the day's end, they're going to lie side by side in their graves. And unfortunately, that does happen. She passes away. It gets called in the battle. He steps 1 foot out the door and he gets shot through the heart. So they are buried somewhere in that cemetery. It's right near the courthouse. You have the museum itself, which was I believe it was some kind of like a clerk office way back. A gentleman hanged himself in there. The conditions were horrible. And then you have other just homes and shops of the time that again have been brought to the location or are original to the location. So it's a very unique, and you have an ice cream shop in the middle of all that too. So
Well, I'm excited to see you and be part of that investigation. It's great to have you back in the city doing an investigative series. So
thank you.
looking forward to seeing you. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to hearing this later and what else you got coming up this season.